Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. This podcast explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, always with an underlying question of how it is that we can live with the psychedelic experience in a way that betters us as people, personally, in our relationships, and in our responsibilities to the world. It's with that latter part in mind that we invite Stephen Jenkinson to the show to talk about wonder and inquiry, and in particular, wonder and inquiry in troubled times. Stephen Jenkinson, MTS, MSW, is an activist, teacher, author, and farmer. He is the founder of Orphan Wisdom School in Toronto, Canada, and is the author of 4 books, including Die Wise, A Manifesto for Sanity and Soul, the award-winning book about grief and dying and the great love of life. In 2015, he created Nights of Grief and Mystery with Canadian singer-songwriter Gregory Hoskins. With a 5-piece band, they have mounted international tours and released 3 albums, most recently Rough Gods and Dark Roads. Most recently insofar as his teaching, a 4-part live stream speaking series called A Generation's Worth was presented in the winter of 2020 and has since become a book by the same name, A Generation's Worth, but with the subtitle Spirit Work While the Crisis Reigns. I'm holding up a picture of it here on YouTube. Audio listeners only, you'll just have to take my word for it. Anyway, so Stephen is on the show to talk about, like I said, inquiry and wonder in troubled times. And it's his 3rd time on Adventures Through the Mind. And although this interview stands on its own, I encourage you to go back and listen to those previous interviews if this is your first time with Stephen's work. Those previous interviews being episode 59, What Dying Means, and episode 105, More Considerations on Dying in a Death-Phobic Culture. Also, alternatively, you could just dive straight into Stephen's work, such as his book, A Generation's Worth, or Die Wise, as I mentioned in his bio. Links to getting involved with all of his stuff, my interviews, his books, singer-songwriter, Nights of Grief and Mystery stuff, all of that will be in the description to this episode or in the show notes at jameswjesso.com. Before we get into this interview, I would like to give a big thanks to my patrons on Patreon who make this podcast possible, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description to this episode, wherever you are catching it. Those people whose names are in the credits give significantly, and the credits are an added thank you for that significant contribution. But a big thanks to all of my patrons in general, because if it wasn't for you, I would not have the reliable income basis by which I can commit full-time and energy to the production of this show and the finances that go along with that type of production. It also allows me to maintain creative curation of the show without having to fall into the concerns of what will get the most viewers and what will be the most pleasing for sponsors, while also maintaining the show for free at all times for anyone who cares to look into it and for everyone who has ever gotten value from it. If you're not yet a patron and you'd like to contribute to the production of this show in a financial way, you can become a patron on Patreon by going to patreon.com/JamesWJesso or by leaving a one-time donation via PayPal or cryptocurrency. Any and all donations are thoroughly welcomed. Everything is something, and it all adds into the foundation upon which I am able to continue to commit to the production of this show for you. So thank you. With that said, we're going to get into the interview with Stephen, but first I'm just going to make a comment, which is that on request of the Orphan Wisdom Stephen Jenkinson team, I'm actually going to include a clip from one of the tracks off his recently released albums. The track is Hippie Radio, and it comes from the live album Dark Roads. And why I chose this clip is presented in my first question that follows the clip, but just so you're aware, that's what's coming your way now before we actually get into the interview with Stephen. And we begin now. Enjoy.
Yes. Yes, I hear you. Me too. Not necessary, though. High praise, but not necessary. How about this? A human being pronouncement on the mysteries of life, the ones that wrap itself around our ordinary days, is something like a water spider pronouncing over the depths of the ocean. It's understandable, but it's kind of beginner's error, really. And I don't know about your education, but I certainly know mine was a war on mystery. That's how it was conducted. Like mystery was the problem, mystery was the gap, knowledge was the solution, more knowledge equals less mystery equals a better life for us all. My God, your God, somebody's God, come on now. How about this? Could it come to pass that we could be mystified and consider that being edified instead of being stymied? Maybe so. And how about this one? It would appear to me that we have been made and graced, and to a certain degree, let's say troubled, by the capacity to imagine eternity. But our imagining itself is tied to the coming and going of days. Now, you could consider that some kind of taunt. You could, or you could consider it some kind of assignment, whereby you might get to make peace in your days with the ending of days and call that a mystery that has you in mind instead of proceeding without you.
All right, so let's jump right in. Stephen Jenkinson, thank you, and welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thanks so much.
Listeners will just have heard a clip from your track Hippie Radio off your album Dark Roads, that track being probably the most evocative for me. And the clip ended with the part that says, "A mystery that has you in mind." And I selected this clip because I felt somewhat baffled by it. And as such, feel like I'm on the edge of on the edge of what I understand, even trying to formulate a question about it. But here goes. And
Okay.
I have this question written down so it doesn't come out too jumbled.
Okay.
One of the prevailing themes I have noticed in my exploration of your work over the years is what seems to be the suggestion that the manner of our inquiry is as important, if not explicitly underwrites, what we come to discover out of what we are inquiring about. Assuming I'm even close to the vein on this one, how does the manner of our inquiry apply, if at all, in living in a way that allows one to, quote, make peace in your days with the ending of days and call that a mystery that has you in mind instead of proceeding without you?
Well, wonder has to be God's middle name, both as a verb and as an adjective. Wondrous in that case. Our manner of wondering might be the fullest expression of being a human, but it doesn't rescue us from prejudices galore masquerading as wonder. In other words, seeking after affirmation is not the same thing as wondering. Wanting to be right is not the same thing as wondering if there's such a thing. So you could say that language, which is the way by which we actually are doing all this wondering, is the thing that guides the wonder. With a soft hand, only sometimes. Often with a very fierce, savage, and intolerant hand, depending on how we're coming to the business. So your language either honors the spirit of genuine, disciplined inquiry or thwarts it entirely, delivering you to a foregone conclusion that was determined by the language you employed to wonder in the first place.
Wow, that was a very concise answer.
I've done this before.
Wow, I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready. Maybe you can comment a little bit on what was the phrase? Something about a war on mystery, something about our education
Being a war on
mystery. Yeah, can you comment about that, please? Because that also was something that has really struck me when I heard that.
Mm-hmm. I could probably lament over it rather than just comment on it. Yeah. The Latin word from which we derive our word educate means to lead out. It's the very undoing of indoctrination, let's say. So a radicalizing education, bearing in mind that nobody owns the word radical, it simply means pertaining to the root of things. A radicalizing education is an education that's extremely hard on knowing, but remarkably affable where learning is concerned, right? Knowing is an acquisitive, swelling kind of proposition. I've never heard anybody say, for example, well, yesterday I knew such and such a thing, and today I don't know that. I've never heard any formulation remotely like it, which suggests that knowing is a permanent condition. Once you know something, it's on the mantle forever, so to speak. Learning, on the other hand, it borders on the caustic. It's so, it calls into question so fundamentally the questions as well as the answers that you just simply can't gather up as you go when you're learning. You're losing as you go. And this is why elders, by the time they make it to that point in their lives, if they do, are the people who know the least by virtue of having learned the most and having paid the price for doing so. So an education of young people shouldn't be the terrific and lamentable departure from that understanding that it's become. It shouldn't be preparatory for gainful employment in an unsustainable economy. To take an obvious example, what it should be is providing young people the capacity to wonder fundamentally about that which they're being prepared for, even unto including their wondering itself and their preparation. This is what we owe in an allegedly free society. This is what we owe to the youngest of our citizens, to radicalize the understanding of citizenship so it ceases to become a burden of rights and privileges and is more understood as a scheme of obligation and performance, occasionally interrupted by upside.
The way you talk about wonder and learning, I think about how I often hear the term used. So, and I'm going totally off the rails with my questions, which is, oh, how wonderful, which is something like very pleasant, very positive, very sort of awakening of that which is good and inspiring about the world. Inspire, I guess, is to say to bring in the spirit of a thing, but it still sort of is underwritten by this wondering is a positive thing in the sense that it feels good.
Right.
And yet I've also heard you talk about, and I think this was maybe in reference to ayahuasca or some sort of spiritual quest for like the light and the beauty and the good and the love, something like, really authentic encounters with the divine is not necessarily a good feeling endeavor. And so when I hear you talking about wonder, I think I understand that it's not an easy thing or a safe thing. And yet I have this other sort of use of the language as it's embedded in the way that it's common, which is that it is a happy thing. It is a joyful thing. And maybe you can comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, the parallel would be how many times you've spoken to people where the adjective deep is thrown around
with absolutely uncritical regard for its inevitable upside. The deeper you go in your life, when you have deep thoughts and the rest. Do you know, there's a reason that the depths are only occasionally plumbed. There's a reason for that. What do you think it might be? That the deep is not what we bargained for. We are, for the most part, surface dwellers, are we not? You appreciated the Hippie Radio, so you remember it off the top. It begins in a way, something like this. A human being pronouncing over the mysteries of the world is like a water spider presiding or pronouncing over the depths of the ocean. I like that. And I'm proud of the formulation because it helps clarify things tremendously. We are water spiders. We're masters of surface tension. You could say that's how we stay afloat. But staying afloat is staying adrift, you see, and the depths are lost to you when you navigate according to, fair weather before all. So the simple truth is, in a time such as this one, if there has been such a time as this one, we have no obligation to be okay and to proceed as if that's the goal. We have an obligation to be dumbfounded by the unchartedness of the times we find ourselves in. And dumbfounded is not the same thing as paralyzed, but it is paralysis for competence addicted people, right? So the amazing thing about wonder, about learning, is that they're extremely hard on your capacity to feel in charge. And all I would offer in recompense for that is, well, consider our track record while we've been in charge, and ask yourself, please, whether or not it's all it's cracked up to be, and whether the world can afford another regime of deeply successful humans. It doesn't look like it.
Although I understand that you are far from someone who advocates for or even speaks to psychedelics or psychedelic experiences, and have been a fair critic of the language around them and their sort of slow weaving into palliative care. And I have also found that your work, especially around mystery, has actually been something that's been an incredibly positive contributor for me to grok the largesse, is this the word I'm looking for? The incredibleness of these experiences. Mm-hmm. The incredibleness, including the wow and the whoa, and I was commenting with somebody recently talking about the sort of like return of the psychedelic medicine into the therapist's office. And I had said to them that I felt really uncomfortable with the idea that these incredible things that were used for millennia to crack people open in really profound and upsetting ways are being used now as the next tool to wellness, and possibly being wielded by people who have never had the experience themselves. And I thought of something that you had talked about in your A Generation's Worth series about the world tree withered, and that the world tree is meant to keep the gods from us, not necessarily to connect us. And my comment was, this is why there's so much importance around ceremony and structure and all the rest, is to make sure the levees are held pretty strong before we start cracking things open. And this is far from a request for you to comment on psychedelics or what have you. It's more an invitation to maybe open up about what you mean by the gods and the world tree withered, especially in a time when the old anchoring rods of societal institutional stability, correctness, and certainty seem to be unraveling all around us.
Well, apropos of the psychedelics, I really don't have anything to contribute You know, I certainly am not in the habit of making a case against them. I'd welcome the case to be made for them. And my only likely response would be something like, could it be that the reinvention of psychedelia as a psychotherapeutic mother's little helper, I let it in there, didn't I? Is, to my mind, is a symptom masquerading as a cure. It is something like our country has legalized, let's call it euthanasia, physician-assisted death, and it's by its advocates, this is deemed to be the great leap forward. Why? Because it solves the problem of the involuntariness upon dying. How does it do so? Well, it reacquaints you with the mania of your self-determination. That's how it does it. In other words, it places your demise into your hands where, quote, apparently it rightfully belongs. So my job is to wonder about that and imagine out loud the possibility that when you have the malady dictating the cure, be not surprised that the cure is another aspect of the malady, and that 2 generations down the road, the malady is more emphatic than it ever was before that particular cure came in. So we could simply, alter our head by a few degrees and say, what circumstance gives rise to the notion that ordinary reality, ordinary perception, needs such a fundamental undoing and rehabilitation that nothing short of a crack, the famous Leonard Cohen crack and everything, becomes mandatory and a basic human right because it's in the world, in the Amazon, for example. So that's what I bring to it. I simply wonder what has befallen a people whereby an exceedingly abnormal experience becomes mandatory for being able to experience things ordinarily. When did ordinary experience become basically not good enough or simply not enough for us? And I mean, obviously one of the answers is modernity. Modernity applied to an ordinary person's ordinary life is not a lot to celebrate. It's a lot to count. It's a lot to line up for, but it's not a lot to celebrate. I think we're on safe ground acknowledging that. So maybe rather than psychedelics, I shouldn't say rather, aside from psychedelics, couldn't the line of inquiry move more emphatically in the direction of wondering how things got to be this way, rather than imagining our way out of this way again and again and again?
Thank you. That feels like a very clear and well-articulated, I assume, well-articulated wondering about that.
Thank you.
I'll hang on that.
We deserve an ordinary life. It's not the booby prize. The labor over trying to understand is an ordinary person's assignment. This is an honorable, noble undertaking that's available to us. And I'm not persuaded that medicinally enhanced wonder remains wondrous. I mean, after all, might it not, for example, imbue us with a sense of a dissatisfaction with the ordinary life so profound as to make ordinariness unlivable? Hankering after the peak experience, the great revelator instead. Yeah, that's that would be one of my concerns about it.
I think that's a very fair concern, Stephen, and I've actually seen it already presently unfolding in people, and I've also seen the opposite become true, where the experience brings people back into the beauty of an ordinary life and brings people back into the beauty of what might it be to live not lined up and counting? And what might it be to bring something of meaning back in where now meaning has been revealed to be gone, or meaningfulness or something? And I think your concerns are ones that are really important for anyone who's choosing to reach towards psychedelics for this thing or that thing to have in mind. So thank you.
You're welcome. Taking that stuff might be another answer to the question that you asked me originally, which is the manner of our wondering predetermines where we end up. Mm-hmm. Could it be that there's something in ingesting something from another place that's not your home place, that has a consequence you'd never intend, never count on, that's subtle instead of miraculous? And the subtlety is corrosive, ultimately. As I said earlier, none of us have to make the entire case for anything. We're obliged to wonder about it from different points of view, and that's all you hear me doing. No doubt, as you say, people register discernible benefit. The labor remains, though, on the far side of the peak experience. There's still the grim work of translation.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So I'm gonna move into my next scripted question, and hopefully it doesn't sound like I'm repeating myself. I have introduced a number of close friends to you over the last year, explicitly. Well, actually, over the last few years, but explicitly because your work has been incredibly valuable in my life. Because of your teaching sessions, because your work has been incredibly valuable to my life in general, but also because your teaching sessions and interviews have felt like they orient me in what has been a very difficult year because of the COVID-19 pandemic and all that has come with and from it. The manner of inquiry you bring to sickness and dying, and thus health and aging, and wrestling with troubled times is refreshing in a triggering honest heartbreak kind of way. And in a time where what and how much and how certain we are about what we know seems to be less and less a marker of sanity, your work often feels like a raft of wisdom in an ocean of information and personal opinions on parade as facts and truth. Mm-hmm. Is this wisdom? And if so, then what role is it you are playing by offering it? And what role is being asked of me by acknowledging it as such?
Well, the last part of your question is probably yours to answer, yours to wrestle and discern as you're able. First of all, I should say you're very kind with all your allegations about my consequence. We're both Canadians, so this is an awkward moment. But of course I appreciate it, and I don't in any sense take it for granted, because I assure you that for every one of these assurances, there are legions of blank faces or genuine enmity. So, I was introduced. I've sat through many an introduction, and it's an interesting experience to find yourself in the introduction some way, somehow. Really what people are talking about is their encounter with you, and not so much about you. During the course of her elaborate and very kind introduction, she referred to me as a visionary. And I knew two things immediately. First of all, this is not good to be, before you get up there, to be referred to as a visionary means that a good number of people in the audience are going to sit arms crossed, waiting for you to envision and resemble the patriarchs of old, so to speak. So it's a setup. It's not intended to be, but I know that it is. Secondly, I'm not sure that visionary most accurately describes the ramshackling endeavor that I've stumbled upon. So when I got up to respond and to perform, I acknowledged the kindness of the words, and I came to the question of visionary. And as I did so, a word came to me. Now, I say word came to me because I've never heard the word before, and as far as I know, it's not in the dictionary. And I said, a visionary, not likely. Divisionary, though, I think so. Yeah. So I have a divisionary's assignment, which is to, not by intention, but by consequence, somehow introduce the subtlest of separations between people and their certainties. Not to introduce self-doubt as a kind of the latest torment or the latest, get well quick scheme, but that there's something about the willingness to cultivate ambivalence that grants our humanity to us, I think. Ambivalence, has nothing to do with indecision, even though there's many a synonym in the current dictionary that would suggest that to you. The word ambivalent simply means the capacity to carry a number of tendencies or possibilities or trends or whatever it is that are mutually exclusive at the same time without prematurely collapsing in the direction of one at the expense of all the others. That's what ambivalence means. Understood that way, it's a skill. And it's a skill that's a consequence of the exercise of wonder, among other things. And so divisionary doesn't mean to divide people from each other. It means something much subtler in the direction of, you use the word wisdom. So let's wonder for a second, could there be a difference, should there be, between wisdom and prejudice? Off the top, you'd say, God, I hope so. And so would I. But one of the ways you can wonder about is not the content, but the machinery, if you will. What's the consequence of wisdom as distinct from prejudice? My quick answer would be, you've never heard anybody going for a weekend retreat to work on their prejudices. That is, to fine-tune them and to become ever more elaborately capable of being prejudicial. Why not? I mean, it sounds nonsensical. It's not, though. The answer is that prejudices take care of themselves. That's why you don't need to go to a weekend workshop on the West Coast for it. They take care of themselves, meaning they are self-sustaining, meaning they are transferable, meaning they're inheritable. And that's how you come by them. They come with the mother's milk. So it's a shocking observation to make, that the thing that's most available to us, the most self-sustaining and reconfirming, is the stuff that probably doesn't mean us too good. That means us harm inadvertently. How is it distinct from wisdom? Wisdom is by definition not transferable, not inheritable, because it's so site-specific. Wisdom arises as a consequence of the troubles of the times and the claim they lay upon you as a citizen of those very times. That's why wisdom, the content of wisdom, properly alters and shifts from one generation to the next. So the notion that the wisdom of the ages is the rock solid thing we should go by, no, that's wisdom atrophied in that fashion is a prejudice. So what I'm suggesting instead is, rather than the content of wisdom being transferable from one generation to the next, it's the fact of wisdom. It's the possibility of wisdom. It's wisdom arising again out of a consequence of need and desperateness in a time such as our own, for example. The example of one generation undertaking its spirit work becomes the standard that the next generation is held to, not the content of what they came up with, but their willingness to undertake the work. And that, I would suggest to you, is what tradition, properly understood, is. It's not a tyranny of lingering odor from previous times. What tradition genuinely is one generation's effort to get it right, and then follow the subsequent generations not having the obligation to be tyrannized by the truancy of its predecessors.
Your final statement there connects personally to your first statement, or your first part of it, addressing that question. The final one being the truancy of our predecessors, and the first one being yourself as a divisionary.
Mm-hmm.
And I have known people who have encountered your work, and their immediate response is, pardon me for a second, but fuck this guy. And generally,
likewise, I would say, right back at you.
And generally, it has come from people who are of your demographic, age-wise,
no doubt,
right? And and it usually is in response to what feels like maybe feels like a
indictment.
Yeah, and so. And so, I mean, I've heard, this isn't exactly a question. It's more like a comment that is hopefully inclining you to further elaborate on that. Yeah.
What's up with people hating on me, you mean?
No, the indictment, the truancy work of the generation that you are a part of.
Well, it's not easy to be impugned. There's nothing joyous or revelatory about it. I did when we recorded our record last year, one of the pieces I came up with, I called it Fate, which is a little 4 quartets meditation on the relationship between my generation and yours, basically. And I was wondering about what the obligations might be. And it fell to me yet again to acknowledge what is, painfully obvious to some and unbearable to others and no big deal to a few. And that is that on the watch of my generation, things have become demonstrably worse. Now, if you don't accept that as a premise, then you can tune out the rest of the observation. But I think that's a given. Sadly and tragically, it's a given that we collectively, not completely, but collectively, engaged our peak income generating years in generating our peak incomes. And the world has suffered in direct proportion to us being all we could be. That's the news. So do I expect anybody who is shadowed by that observation to thank me? No. Do I exempt myself by virtue of saying so? No. Well, then what am I doing? If I don't stand accused of the very thing I'm describing, and in so doing become disqualified, what am I doing? One of my answers is, belatedly, I'm doing the work that probably should have been done earlier and much more collectively. The work of fessing up. It's not a question of guilt. It's not a question of shame, but it is most assuredly a question of consequence. Okay? I'm not invoking the ages-old biblical thing of the primordial trespass and the spiritual indebtedness that ensues and never being able to get out of it or anything of the kind. I'm simply saying this. We have the word in the English language, fate, which we got from the Romans. We know what it means today. It means the fix is in, there's nothing to be done, too bad for you, or something of the kind. It never meant that until fairly recently. It meant this. Fatum was the Latin word that meant that which has been spoken, okay, or decreed, you could say. It was a shorthanded way of referring to what the gods have said, okay? Now, if you're a monotheist, voluntary or otherwise, and you hear the phrase, what the gods have said, you automatically hear foregone conclusion, that's the way it is. it doesn't mean that to a polytheist. Okay, by definition, it doesn't mean that. When the gods have spoken, this is their shorthanded way of saying, well, there is a thing that we could acknowledge called the natural order of things, the way things tend to go, the prevailing weather, things of that kind. Okay, that's the God's presence. It does not foreclose upon the next part. The next part goes like this. Now that the gods have spoken, what shall you do? That is not a given. That remains up to us. Me doing this interview with you is in some small measure my answer to the question, well, now that the gods have spoken, and part of their litany includes the truancy of my generation, what shall I do? And I win friends and influence people thereby. That's a joke.
Yes, Napoleon Hill reference, I imagine, part of that generation's conquest to peak income. So I'm gonna move on to my next scripted question.
Okay.
The COVID-19 pandemic has shuttled us into our homes, isolating us from each other on the narrative of each of us being like the perpetrator of the ultimate sickness and death of others, or others of ourselves, and any decisions other than what we are being told is decidedly selfish to the highest order. Be that narrative true or not, it has forced some kind of change into how we do things, for better or for worse. One of those changes, assuming we are following the rules, is the isolation, the staying home, and the being alone. And many people I have spoken to, as well as the narrative in general, speaks of this pandemic sheltering in place over the last year as equating to having lost something. And for certain, we have lost something, but the language of loss often comes through in a way where what was lost was something that should be, or that we are fundamentally entitled to. And often the response is something like grievance and or defeat and or keep calm and carry on until we get the life we're supposed to have back. So my question to you is this. What's your take on this language of loss and where it appears to be coming from?
That's very well articulated. Confoundment.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, the presumption of loss is that there was once upon a time a found, or a had, if you will. I have yet to hear a language employed that does justice to the particulars of the plague as we have been obliged to live it. Why do I point that out? Well, I think we're coming full circle to the first question you asked me about wonder, I think. I'm going to make the case here that if I had a small achievement and contribution that I made in my days in the death trade, it may come down to this. I observed early on that people, that means dying people, their families, and the people paid to know better, were all employing a language of rehabilitation, of coping, of trauma, half a dozen other attributes, none of which derive in any direct way from the realities of dying. All of them, psychology being another one, all of them are imported into the realm of dying as if they were helpmates in the project, but none of them were. Every one of them were obscuritan in their principal consequence. In other words, when people speak to dying people as if their dying is principally a psychological reality, then they're obliged to respond in kind and to consider themselves that way for the sake of having a conversation or for the sake of benefiting from the help that's being offered. Non-compliant would characterize you if you questioned the idea that dying is principally a psychological reality. So what I tried to do early on was begin to craft a language in speaking with dying people and subsequently about them, wherein the realities of dying could actually appear. And I think I did it. Not completely, not to my satisfaction, but at least to my encouragement. And from that day to this, it's occurred to me that the language that we employ to articulate our alleged understanding of something can well be the demise of that understanding very, very easily. And that brings me back to what I said initially in response to your question, which is I'm not persuaded that there's a plague amenable language that has appeared. What we have is the same old language that comes from the alleged 5 stages of grief and the rest. The assumptions of trauma, the psychodynamics of the enterprise. You yourself said that COVID has driven us indoors. Well, it's an understandable characterization, but it wouldn't be accurate. COVID has done nothing of the kind. COVID is not a beast come down from the mist bands and the moors to rock your world, right? It's a naturally occurring intrusion of something of the wilderness into the suburbs. That's basically what it is. And it's important not to overly demonize its appearance, you see. So if it's basically a naturally occurring thing, then from whence comes its monstrosity? My answer would be, it comes from our reactivity to it. The allegation that we're being thwarted and we're being denied basic human rights. Like what? Like the right to proceed as if we have no obligation to our fellows. Like the misunderstanding that health derives from being disease-free. It doesn't. Health derives from contending with what would undo your health. I mean, at some level, everybody knows that. It's a basic homeopathic principle, right? So these things are not our adversary. Well, I would say they're not our enemies. They are, though, our adversaries, which is to say they are the helpmates along the involuntary path of learning. That's what they could be. I'm gonna confess something that's going to sound probably monstrous or indelicate, at least. In the early days of this thing, a year or more ago, I had a sense of vast opportunity was opening up before us very quickly. And the opportunity was this. Heretofore, there's nothing in the news that in a single moment has the consequence of galvanizing the errant attention span of modern people long enough to remove their sense of personal volition and an out clause and replace it with a sense of implacable urgency that's non-negotiable. That's the way I saw the oncomingness of the plague. I thought, this could be the big one. We were concerned, enormously concerned, and rightly so, about bodies piling in the streets and all the rest. That was a realistic concern in those days. Of course, that has not come to pass, except in a few places in the world, certainly not where I live. And the consequence has been what? A pining after, you guessed it, the good old used to be. Did you hear anybody parading in the streets in the pre-COVID days, celebrating the sheer, with giddiness, the sheer ability we had to congregate and be ourselves? I never saw anything of the kind. What about the idea that by virtue of the infectiousness and so on, there's no more funerals and there's no more wakes, or at least not legally? What about that? Yeah, well, that's a terrible loss. Wait a second. I'm going to go on record right now because I was in the trade. I was there. This is not a matter of opinion. I'm going to tell you that in those days when we had free rein to grieve without grievance, it had very few takers, man. That's why I had a job. That's why Diewise has sold in the numbers that it has. Because when the opportunity was there, there were very few takers. I was a drag then, and I'm a drag now for virtually the same reason. We haven't lost anything. We weren't exercising most of those things we now imagine have been deprived of us. See, a certain degree of mindless distraction, we've been deprived of that. Well, it's not a terrific loss. See, so, I mean, there's no way to sum up this sort of catastrophic take on the recent past. But I would say this, the COVID-19 is already a savagely lost opportunity. That's the loss that registers for me. That we were, well, I'll finish with a little etymology, which will never fail you. So we have the word nostalgia. If you know anything about the list of ingredients on your headache prescription or whatever it is, you'll see the word algia somewhere in there, probably neuralgia or something of the kind. It means pain. Who knew? Nostalgia means something like the pain upon returning. Literally, home sickness. That's what nostalgia actually means. And the nostalgia for the pre-pandemic days will prove out to be another twist on our remarkable capacity to market to ourselves our own bewilderment and sorrows.
Thank you. So we have only just a couple minutes left, so I'm going to see if I can evoke from you something akin to what I've seen in your 60-second answers series with Gregory Hoskins,
right,
for respect of your time, but also for respect of really wanting to get this question in.
Okay.
From what I understand, you're about to be publishing a new book, which I am looking forward to adding to my collection of your other books.
Thank you.
Based on your recent live but online teaching series, A Generation's Worth, which I was fortunate to attend. So here's the question.
Okay.
To what and to whom is this book being written, and what aspirations of impact on that what and whom are you working that book in favor towards?
The second part, this is going to sound cheap and uncommitted, but I don't entertain any such visions or of consequence or genuinely. And that's largely out of respect for the wayward person who decides that something I've written might be worth the trouble. As to the first part, though, it follows from the last answer, really. I was desperate to make the case that our obligations outnumber our rights by some considerable degree. And I was acting on a sense of obligation. You know, the root word for obligation is the same root word as religion. It means the temporary alignment, bringing into alignment of disparate things. The consequence being that there's certain things that can ensue as a result of the alignment. And the word alignment has the same root word in it as well, the Lig. Now that's what I tried to do. I tried to bring into some kind of temporary alignment a combination of question and quandary. I think that's what I called it, actually. I didn't call it question and answer. I called it question and quandary. The idea being that questions are the launch pad for making your quandaries manifest, not for banishing them to the hinterlands, in favor of a new certainty, but that we make a kind of uneasy peace with how things have come to be as they are and our extraordinary willingness to forego lucidity for the sake of getting by. I've lost track of the first part of your question, and there's something else I need to say. Could you remind me of it?
The first part was, to what and to whom is this book being written?
Well, I called it, in the introduction, I say something like it began its life as a documentary. I was literally dating my entries every day as a discipline, as a monastic discipline. The 4 themes that made up the sessions: money and dying and elderhood and matrimony. And I was using each one of these as a kind of prism to wonder about the current regime. But quickly I realized that I wasn't documenting the plague experience. I was making a document that is underwritten by the presence of the plague. It's a different orientation completely. And so I called it a sequence of dispatches rather than a journaling exercise. Journaling exercise, not that I've ever done it, but my best guess on the matter is that it's what you do to contend with what John Berger, the writer John Berger, wondered. He said, I suspect that all autobiography begins with the feeling of being alone. There's a lot of that now. And I think our aloneness is overstated, or it's certainly not a product of the plague. It's a product of how the plague came among us instead. So I called it a Doomsday book. You may be familiar with the reference. It's mispronounced often as Doomsday book. But that's not what it was called. And it's a brief history lesson, which you'll probably edit out, and I understand why. So the English were overwhelmed yet again, this time by the Normans in 1066 and all that. And within 2 or 3 years, the Norman conquerors sent out across the countryside teams of what we would now call chartered accountants, basically, or insurance adjusters. And they literally tracked everything that was in the country. They counted everything, documented everything, brought it back, and that was the basis of the taxation system that ensued. I suggest to you that the greatest trauma perpetrated upon the English people was the cataloging of their lives. There's something devastating about that if you want to understand it in contemporary terms, it's the Google mapping of your thoughts, of your strivings, of all of that. Yeah. So I knew then that I wasn't going to make a list of the ways in which we've been forsaken by life in this book. What I decided to do instead was make a pitch masquerading as a plea. And the pitch would something like this. There are people not born today who will look upon people who were alive during the course of the pandemic and wonder what happened to them. Something in the order of my mother's generation and how haunted it was by the Great Depression. The pandemic will be the Great Depression of your generation. Of this, I'm fairly certain. And when the gloves are off and when the all clear horn finally blows, people are going to be absolutely undone to realize that they're not capable of taking up their old position, that there's going to be something fundamentally altered. I'm not sure gone would be the right word, but altered in terms of their capacity to reacquire their pre-pandemic life. It's not there to acquire. And I'm not talking about employment opportunities here. I'm talking about something sort of psychic and mythic and poetic. And this will be the beginning of the undoing that the pandemic has visited upon us. It has not really begun. It never does when the storm is still blowing. But when the winds abate, as they surely will, a year, maybe, whatever it's going to be, we will discover that our fixation upon the picayune and the indefensibly unspectacular and unachieved will be something that we can barely bear in ourselves. Maybe the parallel could be this. You may remember some years ago that Trudeau took it upon himself to finally acknowledge the consequences of the residential school system and issued formal apologies and quietly established a fund to pay people for their trouble, so to speak. And this is only anecdotal, what I've heard about it since. But apparently, amongst the population who were children at the time, they had lived all of those years deep into their agedness themselves. And when Trudeau finally came across with the goods, they began to suicide in extraordinary numbers. Only then. How to understand what that's all about. The parallel I'm suggesting here is that when the pressure of expectation releases, the burden of ordinary life assumes a degree of unbearableness, I think. And I think that's what's coming. So there'll be a degree of psychic distress that the so-called mental health system is in no way anticipating, never mind prepared to respond to. But if they want to take a hint from me while I'm still here, here's my brief suggestion. Do with the pandemic what I did with dying. Find a language where the ordinary realities of the pandemic appear instead of are banished by.
Stephen, thank you so much for your time today, and for what you've offered to the listeners, and for what you're offering in general. And personally, thank you for what your work has brought into my ability to try to make sense of this wacky thing I was given upon my birth or conception, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the invitation to contribute.
Okay. On that, I will do the obligatory inclusion of access links in the outro from here, as to not ask you of it. And I bid you well and goodbye. And looking forward to, if possible, another connection at some point before this story ends for either of us.
You're very kind, man. As to the book, I'm going to self-publish this thing, so I think it's going to be out by. I'm aiming for maybe July at the latest.
Oh, great. Yeah. Awesome.
So, and there's a deluxe edition, if you can bear the thought. And the deluxeness of it all is that I worked with a graphic designer and printmaker in Oaxaca when I was just down there. And we developed a sequence of 5 prints that are related to the book thematically. And these prints are available as a kind of add-on to the book. And that's the deluxe part of the edition. And they look pretty damn good. Do you know what grabado is?
No, I do not.
That's a Spanish word. It means the word engrave is in the root of the word. So it's a kind of reverse engraving, right? With running through a press and the whole, and they're just miraculously handmade, like almost everything I've done. And this book is gratefully no exception. So there's that to look forward to. I'm looking forward to it, and I was just reading through it today, and it seems to pass inspection.
Great. Well, I'll be sure this interview comes out in a time where people can immediately click over and pick it up. So thanks again, Stephen.
Thank you, man. Thanks for your time.
Okay. And cut. Okay. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. If you liked it, well, you could just go check out Stephen's work. You could go check out his new book, A Generation's Worth, Spirit Work While the Crisis Reigns. The interview that you just heard was recorded a while ago, a couple months ago, and his book is now available, so you can jump right over and buy it. Links are in the description or at the show notes at jameswjesso.com for episode 148. Or you can check out my previous interviews with him, also linked in the show notes. Or you could check out one of his albums with Gregory Hoskins. The clip that you heard today was from Dark Roads, and all of which is available. So you could also support the show financially by becoming a patron or by leaving a one-time donation in PayPal or cryptocurrency. And if you're interested, I am anticipating, it's looking likely that Stephen and I are going to have another conversation before the snow falls here in Canada. And that conversation will be releasing sometime shortly after that. And if you'd like to stay up to date, you can sign up for my newsletter. I do a monthly digest newsletter that comes out monthly, and it presents whatever you missed since the last email, and then very periodically I release personal life updates. So yeah, please sign up for the newsletter, also linked in the description here or at jameswjesso.com. And that's all for this episode. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. And until then, take care.